Craig is Paul. You are going to be talking about mysteries and monsters.
Yes.
So we do podcasts and things.
Yeah, my show is called Mystery and Monsters. I also co-host for Ghost Story Bands, which is an Anglo-Canadian show. I've been doing for 3.5 years with my co-host and flown in from Canada. The first time we've ever met in person. You were? So, come to Kingston before.
And you are also now on GPN as well.
Yes, I'll let you
If you want to watch Paul's podcast, you can find, I think I've got a couple on so far.
Yeah.
You can go on GPN, it's free subscription, free TV. It's also on mobile devices. I'm not mentioning t-shirts. I'm getting all the rubbish. I'm not buying them now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is the last guest speaker, and in an hour's time, it'll be Jane and myself to close it all down. We will also be telling you if we will be doing ParaMeet next year, and if we are, what sort of shape that will take. Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. One of the ironies of being asked to do this was trying to come up with a topic that fits in with the ethos of the weekend and who was here. So, obviously, last year I covered a lot of different subjects. I spoke to abductees, cryptozoologists, paranormal investigators, but I thought it ended up being quite fortuitous that I chose to do strange encounters with paranormal animals for this talk, especially as the Nando Frodo and the Talking Mongoose have just been released this weekend, which I thought was quite apt. As the first person or character I wish to cover is, of course, Jeff, the Talking Mongoose. And primarily all down, like most people of a certain vintage of my era, and I was introduced to Jeff through the fabulous original book I was born in the late 70s, which introduced me to the wonderful story about this family, the Irvings, who were made on the Isle of Man, who at some point discovered that they attracted a talking mulgars to live in their farmhouse. He was a bit of a character, and a wicked sense of humour, was addicted to cheese and biscuits, used to catch the local bus into the town, catch some gossip, and he would tell everybody, and all the great drugs in the world of parapsychology in those days came to see him. Nando Frodo, Howard Price was an investigator who came several times, and it was quite funny that when I decided to talk about Jeff, and here he is, there's a sketch done by Vori, who was the daughter who was having these experiences. A friend of mine, Richard Freeman, who's a member of the Centre for Fortean Zoology in Devon, has currently just returned from a trip to the Isle of Man, looking into where the farmhouse used to be, because it's just sadly been demolished since. So Richard said, "Oh, I hear you're doing a talk about strange animals. Would you like to hear about what happened when we went?" And so I said, "Yeah, I'd love to." So Richard very kindly sent me a message yesterday that said, so in July this year, we took a second trip to visit Cashin's Gap, which is the area where the farmhouse was originally standing. And they'd done a seance near the remnants of where the farmhouse was, and nothing happened. It was quite uneventful. They were a bit disappointed. So Richard decided to decamp back to the hotel and take some refreshments, so we say, for a few drinks. And they went to bed, and he was sharing a room with another researcher called Jesse Tonks, who lives in Sheffield now. And Jackie was awoken at 2 a.m. by some strange noises, like there was an animal scurrying around in their bedroom. And so she watched as Richard was being, it seemed as though he was trying to push something off the bed, and she could see the bed and the duvet sort of depressing as though an animal was jumping like a cat, or something was bouncing over the bed. And she could see that Richard was waving his hands and moving his legs as though he was reacting to whatever was on the bed, but it didn't wake you up. And I just found it remarkable that nothing was happening where they were and what they went to see, and yet Richard seemed to have some kind of attachment to whatever it was. Now, sadly, nobody could say it was Jeff that decided to visit Richard at 3 in the morning. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But it's interesting that sometimes when you talk about the paranormal, strange things happen or coincidences occur. And for Richard to have that experience and then say, "Oh, by the way, I know you're doing a talk, would you like to hear what's happened to me?" which I thought was marvellous, really, because it just shows you how these things can sometimes work. So, obviously, this is a very controversial case, and if nobody's aware of it. It is one of those that causes great division in the world of the paranormal. Some people think it's a complete fake. Some people, there's some very dodgy photos of what looks like a piece of wool on a fence. If anything like emotions. And as far as I'm aware, there isn't a population of mongoose running around the Isle of Man. About what it is there. Whether they fetched a few mongoose with them or not, I'm not too sure. So it's always been a case that kind of got me interested into animal ghosts more than anything. And I think these days it's something that tends to get overlooked a lot. It may be something from the early 20th century where there seems to be a lot more cases than weren't being reported. So I was very interested to see if I could dig out some very old ones. So I hope you enjoy the strange ones that I found. There's no guarantee that some of these are as real as the people say, but there are a couple of weird ones.
Jeff.
Jeff. Jeff, he's all to play today. Thankfully, that's why I'm hoping it. So, one of the stranger ones here, and a few people may have heard this, is that there are two notorious ape ghosts that are apparently residing in the UK. One is famous. I'm not really sure. I can't find how this version of the story is called, and it's known as Martin's ape. Lives in Alhampton Hall, which is in Devon. And the story goes, well, there are three origin stories, that they had a pet ape who was very keen on one of the daughters that lived in this house. And so it would follow her everywhere. And this daughter either had a bad mood and ran around the home, slamming doors, and the ape got trapped in a mood, or she went to a secret room to take her own life because her heart had been broken, and the ape had followed her in. She didn't realise. The ape couldn't get out, but she obviously died. Or it chased her in there, and they both died. So there are three origin stories to how this thing appeared. One of the strange things about this particular case is it's actually the very first episode of Most Haunted, where they went looking for Martin's ape, because people were reporting that you could hear it scratching and pacing, and there is a great hall, which seems to be some kind of hotspot in this particular property where all the ghosts come into the Great Hall. So there are 5 different spirits that are supposed to reside in the hall, and they all come to the Great Hall. And however, the reason Martin's ape has become notorious is because he apparently, how's the politest way I can say this?
Spanks the monkey.
Yes, he tends to rub his own groin area when he encounters people and while staring at them. Now, I can't find out where this kind of the last 20 years, he's always got mentioned about how he brings dirtiest ghosts. He tends to startle people, but he's also renowned for swinging on chandeliers. But the scratching and pacing and things are heard, and it's one of those things that the other ghost of an ape is known as the Barbary ghost, the Barbary ape ghost, and he lives in a castle in Wales. And there's a very similar story to that one, that he was rescued by the owner who kept him as a pet and trained him through a series of whistles to basically be like his attack monkey. So if anybody disagreed with it, he would whistle and the monkey would attack his servants or anybody in the locality that he didn't particularly like. However, on this particular origin of this one, a local merchant named Horowitz had come to see the owner of the castle, whose daughter had run off with his son, and they had a furious argument involving him then having to set the monkey on him because he wouldn't leave the hall. He was obsessed, very upset that his son's honour was being slagged off by this local merchant. So the monkey attacked the merchant, who managed to escape with his life and managed to escape. And they ran off. As he was being led out by the servants, who very kindly looked after him, he cursed the owner and said, "No good will come of anyone in this family." Within an hour or so, terrible shrieks were heard from this room where the owner of the castle lived. And the servants thought, look at this, we'll wait till it's morning to come and see the guy. So they came back in the morning to find that their master had been ripped to pieces by this monkey. Now, when I checked what a Barbary ape is, it's what we now know as a macaque. So they're only about so big. So I find it very odd that such a small monkey was able to kill a big man who was allegedly a former pirate. So it was supposed to be a big, strapping beast of a man. And yet, once again, as with the first one, this one has two different endings. So, one, the servants arrived in the hall to find that their master dead on the floor and the monkey is nowhere to be seen. The second one is that they found the monkey feasting on his master's remains. And he scuttled off up the chimney and nobody saw it again. This one is once again heard, seen swinging on chandeliers, they can hear it shrieking, they can hear it shouting. So both of these stories are very odd because they're from a specific period of the 17th century where people would treat pet apes as just pets, like a dog, and they just have free range of the house. And yet they both continue to be experienced into the modern era. So obviously the second one isn't as rude as the first one. I think that's why the first one's probably more famous. I can't find where the naughtiness aspect of the first one has come from. It's just now it will always be known as Britain's a dirty spoon. And the second one is not. So to try and sort of look at other strange creatures based on that, you just think, well, what else could be possibly here? And there are some very odd stories about ducks. And one of my favourite stories is about Francis Bacon, the scientist from the 16th century, who was one of the early experimenters in refrigeration. And he was always trying to find out ways to preserve food in the 1620s. And one of his very famous experiments was that he packed plucked chicken with snow to try and make it last longer. And unfortunately, during the attempt to do these experiments, he caught a chill and passed away within a week, which you think is, well, fair enough, what's so spooky about that? However, I think this is probably the strangest animal ghost in this country, because since then, and especially between sort of 1920 and 1970, several people had encounters in Highgate, where this experiment happened, of being accosted by a very distressed, semi-plucked chicken, running around in circles and squawking. There is a report here from a gentleman who was an aircraftman, Terence Long, who was crossing through the area late one night when he heard noises of what sounded like horses' hooves and a carriage behind him. Turning around, expecting to see a horse in carriage, he was stunned to see something which looked like a half-plucked, shivering chicken, shrieking wildly and running around in circles until it just went pop and vanished into thin air. The fireman, who also had seen this, when speaking to Terence, told him that the bird had been regularly seen in the area and people had chased it, hoping to catch it for dinner. In the mid-war, a bit of chicken would have been a great thing during the rations period. Where one particular soldier chased it, where it ran through a brick wall and he knocked himself unconscious. Later, during that same period, Mrs. J. Greenhill, who was a resident of Highgate, confirmed that she'd also seen the ghostly chicken on a number of occasions, describing it as a large whitish bird. A motorist in the 1960s broke down, also reported seeing this half-plucked chicken in a state of distress, once again, squawking and running around in circles. As he watched it, it once again popped. With a pop as well, it always would pop and vanishes. However, my favourite one of all these sightings was that there was a couple who were walking in the area and decided to take a kissing break on a bench. And so they were being rather amorous, when all of a sudden, the bird fell from above in front of them and once again started to do the squawking, spinning thing and ran away. But this one, it didn't pop off, it just went. That was in 1970. That's the last reported sighting of this half-plucked chicken that runs about squawking. I find it very peculiar because it's a very strange story. It's a very odd, because there's nothing till sort of about 100 years ago. So there's like 300 years where nobody sees a semi-naked chicken anywhere. And yet, since the Second World War, we've had the vast majority of sightings of it. So perhaps it's decided that it's scared enough people and had its revenge on bacon, and it's now decided that it no longer wishes to be here, really. And so when you start to look at these kind of stories, you uncover all kinds of strange ones. There is a story in Cornwall at a pub where the local clergyman, who was known to be quite vicious, apparently passed away. And from that point on, all the people that he had excommunicated from the local church, or banished, or refused to let them have family members buried, were being terrorised by a giant black rooster, who would often peck at their doors and windows, and squawk ham and cheese, and generally harass anybody who had caused the clergyman problems around that period. And so you look at these kind of aspects of these weird animal cases, and you come across problems as well. So there's often it's the unusualness of a creature appearing, such as a semi-naked chicken, or a monkey with a strange hobby, shall we say. That sometimes that's why they stand out. But there are so many stories where people have seen normal things, and one of my favourite ones is a very inconsequential story, but it's from Devon, where a motorist was driving along and saw an old man and his dog was walking up the roads. Nothing unusual about that. And as he got to the junction, he obviously looked in his rearview mirror to check, and they disappeared, completely vanished. So often we may be seeing things that could be tossed as paranormal, but because they're not unusual, we don't register it as a strange occurrence until, as with that one, they completely vanish. And there are loads of stories such as this. The researcher Ruth Rothwell sent me a couple of brand new stories that she's had from people who have had experiences in the modern era of seeing dogs run into walls and vanish. There's a couple from Tring, where a lady called Mandy had seen a dog that was running around in the streets, and other people had seen it. They'd all come out to try and find out whose dog it belonged to, because it was running in and out of the road. And as they all watched, there were 6 of them, it once again vanished as though it had just faded away, and just dematerialised in front of all and just disappeared. And you will always find stories like this when it comes to certain dog encounters. She said the dog wasn't scary, it wasn't like the typical shucks that people sometimes report, especially when I come from Yorkshire. These are normal dogs. There was another lady in Wellingborough who saw a huge black dog which looked like an Alsatian, but when she stared at it, she realised it looked more like a shadow of something that she couldn't see. So she was seeing the shadow and not the actual animal. So from that point, she was watching it. And as she was watching it, it walked up to a tree and didn't come out the other side. So she walked around the tree. There was nowhere for it to go. There was no hole. There was nothing in the tree for it to disappear and to completely vanish. And she said the strangest thing was, it was almost as if the tree was there and the dog just slid into it, because the dog was wider than the tree stump. And yet it never came out the other side. She never saw it again, didn't make any noise. It just vanished. And so when somebody sees something like that, that kind of makes you think, well, is there a connection? Is there a portal there? Is there some kind of gap that allows these creatures to just disappear? Because, as she said, until it vanished, she didn't think anything odd of it, apart from it just looked a bit strange. And it was like, she maybe thought, oh, I could be a bit tired, maybe my eyes aren't working properly. So when it vanished, and that's what made it think, it was very strange. A friend of mine who's a psychic medium from Florida, John Russell, has a wonderful story, which I think when it comes to animal cases, there's something a bit more into this one, because he used to have a cat called Gizmo, who belonged to his neighbour, but as the cats can often do, it decided it preferred to live with John than its actual owners, which I'm sure anybody who's owned a cat over the years will know that sometimes this can happen. I had a cat that moved out and never saw her again. I got back from occasionally, I'd see her on the street, and she obviously moved halfway up the road because she preferred living there for some reason. So he had this beautiful cat that moved in with him, and he became best friends with his dog, Elsa, who was an Alsatian as well. And And everything was fine. I lived with him for a couple of years. And then Thanksgiving, there was a terrible storm outside. And the cat was just being really agitated. It was scratching at the door, it was scratching at the windows, and was trying to get out. And they thought, oh, well, we can't let it out. The weather's terrible. It's just not the right kind of environment for a little cat to be living about it. So eventually, after this had gone on for an hour or so, John decided to let the cat out. Only for 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. And the neighbours had come around and said that unfortunately they'd found Gizmo run over in the road. She'd been killed. So obviously they were all very upset. So a couple of years later, John had moved house. And he was outside hanging some washing. And as he was stood there, he suddenly felt a little rope around his ankles. And he looked down, and lo and behold, there was Gizmo. Which struck John because he'd moved sort of 200 miles from where Gizmo had died. He'd been there a couple of years, so it hadn't happened straight away. And he couldn't understand it. He was stunned that Gizmo had decided to revisit it. But what, for me, makes this story and this experience a little bit more important, I think, when we talk about these particular types of cases, is that Elsa the dog saw the cat as well and started acting as though it was Gizmo. She was jumping, she was yelping, she was running over, and the animals were interacting as well. So not only was John seeing this, the dog was, which then makes you think, well, clearly this is taking this to a different level, because often, as we say, people can be mistaken, you can misunderstand it, you might think it's a different kind of, it's the same breed, but it's not that particular cat. And the fact that Elsa reacted, because at the end of the day, she was a big dog. Dogs and cats traditionally do not just get on immediately. And the dog was just delighted, yelping and running around, rolling on its belly, and Gizmo was jumping over it. And John was like, this is incredible. So he went back inside to get his camera, and as he came out, Gizmo had gone. The cat had vanished. Elsa was sort of looking around, he said, sort of mid-air. He didn't know where it happened or where it had gone, and she completely vanished. But the fact that the dog had also had this emotional response to the cat made John think that something special had clearly happened. Whereas, he could have been mistaken, but the dog certainly shouldn't have been. And there's something about cats. There's a cat that lives in the Guildwood Theatre in London called Bearbon, who used to have a real thing for Judi Dench. Whenever Judi Dench would perform at this particular theatre, Bearbon would basically live in her dressing room. And it also used to really annoy Sir John Gielgud by, he thought, maliciously deciding to sit on his outfit every day. But there was no proof that Bearbon didn't like it. But he would often appear on stage during performances. He was very good at just walking through the set or just jumping and running around and chasing things. And everybody loved Bearbon. He was a real character, because in those days, and they still do in some places, a lot of theatres in London are infested with rice and mats. They may also be supernatural evidence. So a lot of theatres had a house cat who was their mouser. He would keep the areas clean. And Bearbon was known as being a fearsome one, and he would often leave decapitated rodents around the area for the caretakers to clean up. And eventually, he ended up retiring in the country, and he lived till he was 15, I think, and passed away. So within 6 months, Bearbon was now reappearing in the theatre. And he would wander around the aisles, he would be on the stage, people would see him in the rafters, they would see him walking about, people would feel him rubbing against them. He was just seemed to be very settled, but once again, it's one of those where a cat goes somewhere, passes away, and yet returns to where it probably felt the most comfortable, or where it was happiest. And Bearbon is one of those, and he's a legendary cat. He's the only cat ever to have an obituary in the Stage magazine. Such was his strength and legend. And it's not just the normal kind of iron that you think of. Chad Lewis, the American researcher, recently released a book about the haunted legends of Wisconsin. And one of the strangest ones that I've ever heard about or come across is one of those that you don't really think about it in the modern sense of when an animal dies. And in the early part of the 20th century, Wisconsin was the circus capital of North America. virtually all the major circuses in North America were based in Wisconsin. And one of them had an elephant called Ella. And I think this is what I refer to about the things we don't consider. So in 1903, there was a freak storm that came through the area. And there was an electrical storm that basically the tent, the menagerie tent that kept the elephants, was struck by lightning several times. And Ella died from fright. But one of the things that people recognized and realized at that time was the beginning of people understanding how intelligent the elephants were, because there were 6 elephants and the other 5 had all survived. They all were surrounding Ella's body on the floor, nudging her with their trunks. They were trying to give her straw, they were putting straw in her mouth, but unfortunately she was too late. And this is where it strikes me about the things we don't consider in the modern era. It's 1903, what are you going to do with a dead elephant? So they basically got the rest of the elephants to drag Ella's body a mile into the wood. They buried her there because they simply couldn't move her. Which makes you think, well, how many times has that happened perhaps in this country where circuses and fairs had large animals that they simply couldn't move other places? Did they bury them there? So, this particular area of Wisconsin, which is known as Fort Clair, has got reports of people seeing a ghost elephant wandering around. Now, this story is true because about 15 years after Ella had died, they discovered her bones in the woods, and they was being repurposed. They were cutting it away because they were going to build a road. So they had to move the bones. And it's from that point, sort of 1915, 1916, that by moving Ella's bones, this seems to have brought the spirit. The last reported sighting was in 2018, where a woman was driving down the road and saw an elephant just walk across and up into the woods. And at that point, she thought, oh, it must be one of the elephants. She rang the police, reported an elephant, the police came out, and one of the guys said, this is the 3rd time in my career, I think he'd been in the Wisconsin police for 20 years. This is the 3rd time in my career that I've had to come to a report of a loose elephant in this particular area. There was no escaped elephant. There was no elephant going out of the zoo. There wasn't even a circus in the area. And yet Ella is still seen, and there are 30 or 40 witnesses in the last 100 years who have had encounters with Ella. She never makes a noise. She just seems to be trundling along, as if she's trying to catch up with a circus that had to leave her behind because she's passed away. So, those kinds of things, I don't know, it makes you think that how many times in other countries are there elephant ghost stories here that we disregard because we think they're ridiculous? I think, how possibly can we have an elephant ghost wandering about? But circuses were everywhere in the old days. It was a main form of entertainment. A lot of people, it was the first time they would see some of these creatures. Bears as well. And people see, obviously there are a couple of ghost bear stories in this country. Are they remnants to when we had a bear population, or are they from where people used to keep them as pets? I mean, one of the kings of England had a pet polar bear, for God's sake. They used to let swim in the Thames on a very large chain. So, I mean, has anybody ever seen a polar bear in the River Thames? Who knows? Stranger things have happened. I think when we have these kind of stories, we have to then start to take on the possibilities that there are hundreds and hundreds of these stories, but because of the types of animals involved, perhaps people are either disregarding them, or they think they're made up, or they're not taking them into serious consideration. I think, once again, as I referred to about the man walking his dog and then just vanishing into midair, when we see an animal we expect to see, people don't think it's unusual until something odd happens. I have a story here from a friend of mine who told me about this when it happened because he knew I was weird enough to take him seriously. And I wouldn't say, oh, you know, whatever. So in 2018, he took advantage of that fabulous summer we all had. We only used to have seasons, come right down. And he decided that he'd take himself off into the Peak District for a couple of days with his tent and just go wild camping. Out of the way, he'd had a lot going on and he just wanted to sort of reconnect with himself and get back to just spending a bit of me time. So he did all this. He'd had a relaxing couple of days. He was taking in the views. He was going on some wonderful hikes and a bit of rock climbing and just generally just relaxing and chilling out. It was, as he said, blissfully isolated, and he finally found some calm in the countryside after his troubling few months. So on his final morning, he sat half in his tent enjoying his coffee and a rolled-up cigarette, admiring the stunning views, the heather blooming across the moorland all around him. It was a warm, beautiful morning, and he took in the scenes. He spotted a handsome fox dashing and dancing up the hillside near him, about 100 metres away. Smiling to himself, he watched this little fellow stop and sniff here and there as it made its way up a small hill towards a rocky outcrop, sort of adjacent from where he was stood, next to a fence. By this point, the fox had now almost appeared parallel to him, once again maybe 100 metres away. And as it approached the fence, it lifted its head up and looked towards it. And he said it was the first time that the fox had ever connected with it. It had never sort of recognised that it was being watched itself. As though, as he discovered later, he felt as though it was meant to make eye contact with him for what was about to happen. The fox settled and sort of made that move that a dog or a cat makes, that, you know, they're about to pounce on something, when it's tap their hip wiggles. And he just said, I just saw this beautiful fox with its big black brush wagging in the air as it moved across the nullars. He was magnetic, like I was meant to see him make his way towards this fence. What struck me, when he approached the fence, that's for the first time when he looked towards where I was sat, as though he was making sure I was still watching him. 1 second he was there, the next he wasn't. He leapt to go over the fence and disappeared in mid-flight. There was nowhere he could have gone. I was so shocked, I ran across to make sure I hadn't mistaken the terrain or the height of the fence, or thought there was something that would obscure my view that I just couldn't make out being first thing in the morning. When I got there, it took me about 20 seconds. There was absolutely nothing that could obscure the fence, and nothing on the other side for him to hide behind. It was all flat moorland. I just stood there for several minutes walking around and around, thinking I must be mistaken. But there was nowhere for him to have gone. I wasn't scared or frightened. I just felt confused and a little bit perplexed, and in awe that I had witnessed something so magical, because that's how it made me feel. It was as if he permitted me to see his magic that beautiful summer's morning. Was it because of how I was feeling that I needed some kind of affirmation? Or was it just chance? I've been back several times and never ever even seen another fox, never mind a magical one. I can assure you, the strongest thing I'd consumed that weekend was coffee and nicotine. And I think for many who encounter the ghosts of animals, there is a feeling of something special more often than not when anybody sort of encounters them. And the vast majority of people I speak to, when they tell me about a returning pet or a feeling that they get of an animal that they've loved or and has loved them, often for a lot of people it gives them a real sense of happiness and contentment. It makes them feel, I suppose it sort of affirms that animals can love, because why would they come back if they couldn't? Mm-hmm. What makes them come back? What made this fox just appear on that particular morning where he needed something to probably make him realise that he was on the right path? That obviously foxes have always had a mystical element to them, along with hares. There are certain folkloric legends about both creatures being signs of good luck or a change of fortune. And he felt that that was the way. And I think when anybody speaks to me or shares these experiences with me, I've yet to have one where somebody has been scared by their encounter. They're perplexed, they're a bit taken aback, but they're not frightened. A lot of them say that they feel warm. And I think if there's one thing we can take from the encounters that most people's animal experiences is, it gives them an overriding sense of love. And that, I think, is the best thing we can do. So thank you.
No.